Remakes can be such a fickle thing with films because they're often on two extreme sides of a spectrum, with one side being really great and justified remakes that refine the source material like Ocean's 11, The Departed, Scarface, and The Fly. But on the other side of the spectrum, we have absolute lackluster garbage dumps of a remake that serve no purpose and should have never been greenlit, such as Oldboy, Flatliners, The Crow, and Psycho, just to name a few. But it is interesting to try and distinguish what sets apart a good remake from a bad one, and after watching James Watkins' 2024 remake of the dark social satire Speak No Evil, this was a question I struggled with, because although the production and the casting of the Speak No Evil remake was pretty good, I don't know whether having a remake so similar to the source material come out just 2 years after the original film was worthwhile. But before I get into Speak No Evil, I want to talk about what distinguishes a good from a bad remake. So if we take The Fly, for example, we can see that remakes like this are objectively good and arguably better than the original for a lot of reasons. And a big one is the production quality and the advantage of practical effects and VFX advancements that newer remakes have compared to their older source material. But another quality that makes certain remakes good and even better than the source material is when the writers and directors don't just take the story and duplicate it, but they actually enhance the pre-existing stories while integrating their own unique styles into the project. And if we look at Kurt Newman's 1958 adaptation, we can see that it was well received and well respected as a sci-fi thriller with a unique and nuanced narrative that starts off as a mystery about the protagonist and unravels through a series of flashbacks. But if it was so good, why the need for a remake? Well, the studio or director wanting to initiate a remake is not necessarily bad, and if anything, it's quite flattering because it typically means that the original premise was so appealing that it inspired an attempt to improve and modernize the source material, which is exactly what we see with David Cronenberg's 1986 remake of The Fly, which takes on a more sinister body horror approach to the story and even surpasses the popularity of the original. And of course, the practical effects and even the tonality of Cronenberg's remake were much better, but Cronenberg and the writers really added a lot more depth and sensory stimulation not only to the story itself, but more importantly to the character of Seth Brundle, because what is a story without well-rounded characters? And again, no disrespect to Kurt Newman at all, because he was just following the narrative as told in the original short story, but in his adaptation, when Seth Brundle undergoes his transformation into a fly, he had his head covered by a cloth for most of the film, he was unable to speak, and basically became a ghost in the metaphorical sense, which kind of leaves you wanting more as an audience member. And this shortcoming is something that was more than rectified in Cronenberg's adaptation, because in the remake of The Fly, Seth Brundle had a lot of character development, which was accomplished through ample screen time that showcased his entire transmutation, with plenty of moments where it would have been more appropriate in this case for him to actually have a bag over his head. And unlike the original Fly, the master of body horror managed to effectively capture just how horrifying, grotesque, and unfortunate the entire transformation was, which is just one of many reasons that make it such an engaging and impressive remake. So in summary, I would say a good remake is marked by its ability to pay tribute to its source material while also elevating and adding more depth to the lore, either through its storytelling or visual elements, which of course is something that we see Cronenberg accomplish as he stood by the original source material and not only added more innovative details to the story, but filled in gaps that existed in the original Fly. And not all good remakes are as impressive as The Fly, but it definitely functions as a framework for what makes a good remake. And if that's the case, what can be used as a framework for bad remakes? Well, there are a lot, but I don't think there's any remake more diabolical than Gus Van Sant's 1998 remake of Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. And although it's relatively similar to the novel, there are a few characterization differences and detail adjustments made that allow the film to take on a life of its own. Particularly the novel's depiction of Norman Bates as an outright murderer versus Joseph Stefano and Hitchcock's depiction of a traumatized, mentally ill guy with severe maternal issues that you sort of sympathize with. at least for me, and I never understood how remarkable Psycho was until I made this video, because I didn't even know Psycho was based off a novel, which I think says a lot about its structural integrity and iconic status as one of the earliest examples of the slasher genre. And of course that would be difficult for anyone to try and replicate, but that's exactly what Gus Van Sant did. He copy and pasted the fuck out of Hitchcock's Psycho to the point where it was essentially a shot-for-shot carbon copy. There was no ingenuity, nearly zero dialogue or footage discrepancies other than it being just poor quality and soulless, and there was nothing there to enrich the pre-existing story, which is something we do actually see in Bates Motel, with a backstory provided about Norman and his mother during his adolescent years. But for Gus Van Sant, rent was due, and he probably got evicted because it was a commercial failure, and to quote his words, he just wanted to see what would happen. So what makes a bad remake? I would say a bad remake can be defined either by its misappropriation of intellectual property, like what we saw with the Crow remake and most of the Star Wars series. But in the case of Psycho, a bad remake can be defined as something that quite literally has no identity of its own and fails to build upon the story either through small or large details. And they say that imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but the latter part of that saying encapsulates Psycho and other remakes that fail to incorporate any narrative, character, or detail-oriented modifications. Now that we have a pretty solid framework of good versus bad remakes, let's talk about Speak No Evil, and I'll try my best to avoid spoilers, but no promises. So both versions of Speak No Evil follow two couples who are both vacationing in Italy, become well acquainted, and sometime after returning home, the primary couple, who are defined by their failing marriage, receive an invitation to spend the weekend at the other couple's remote house. And things go very wrong from that point onwards, with the host couple constantly forcing their guests into uncomfortable situations like groping each other and abusing their child in front of their guests, and essentially just pushing personal boundaries until there are no more boundaries to push. The plot itself in both cases is really interesting because it's a pretty funny reflection of how people in society, myself included, tolerate interactions that make them uncomfortable out of politeness and maybe even a desire for belonging. And in Speak No Evil, that theme ends up being the primary couple's undoing. And as a standalone film, I thought the Speak No Evil remake was pretty decent until I went and watched the original 2022 Danish version, and the original is far more superior in my opinion, but also a lot more tragic, which may be why some people don't like it that much. But I found that the original was a lot more realistic in some cases, especially in regards to how the host couple was characterized. For example, in the remake, they're absolutely unhinged and erratic, which make it hard to believe that anyone, even a saint, would tolerate them over and over again. But in the original, their true nature is very well hidden, which makes it easy for them to do what they do. And another difference I wasn't fond of in the remake was the depiction of the characters, because the host couple were so aggressive and off-putting that you really have to suspend your disbelief as you're watching it, whereas in the original, the host couple are a lot more cunning with their manipulation and rectify their strange behavior by kind of acting like they don't know what they did, which is a lot more realistic in my opinion. Now, the key difference between the original and the remake of Speak No Evil pertains to how the big discovery about the host couple was made and their individual endings, with the remake being defined by its more heroic conclusion, while the original is defined by its devastation that brought me to tears for about an hour. But the funny thing is, I will probably force my boyfriend to watch it with me because I thought it was just so impressive despite how sad it made me. Does that make me a masochist or a sadist? Which one? I don't know. Maybe both. Now, was a remake necessary?
Absolutely fucking not.
especially with the differences being on the more absurd and exaggerated side with the 2024 remake. And I do think it's pretty strange to make a remake 2 years after the original came out, because usually it's nice and nostalgic to see a remake or adaptation after a decade or so has passed. But James Watkins and the writers were obviously so hungry and desperate to sanitize this story that they just couldn't help themselves. But the most important question is, was it a good remake?
Oh, hell no! Hell no! Oh, hell no!
But because I laid out this framework of what constitutes a good versus a bad remake, I have to be unbiased and say that it probably qualifies as a good remake because it has its own unique differences, such as the original couple being Dutch and Danish, while the updated couple are English and American. And the remake certainly adds more depth to the source material, even if that depth is a bit shallow at times. It offers a reinterpretation of the characters, their internal struggles, and a bit of reasoning for why they are the strange people they end up being, with the censored ending defining an entirely different tone for the story. Overall, I'd give the original Speak No Evil 3.5 stars, and the remake somewhere between 2.5 to 3 stars, which hurts me to say because I love James McAvoy. I love most of his performances, and this one in particular was a demented, testosterone-fueled nightmare. But another thing is that my boyfriend put the idea into my head that most child actors are terrible at their jobs, which is more true in the remake than it is for the original. In the remake, those kids were fighting for their lives, trying to keep their jobs, and I don't know if they succeeded or not. But as always, thanks for being here. Don't forget to like and subscribe. And if you don't, no biggie. I'll just assume you hate me and don't want me to succeed and wish death upon me. But if I were to suggest any one of the two, I'd say at least watch the original film unless you're a puss.